All right, and again, welcome everybody. Alphabet Soup here. We're gonna talk about plenty of different things as it relates to food safety. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. Now, this is not the produce safety course that is an 8-hour course that would satisfy the requirements for compliance with the new FDA rule that I'll get into. So this is just kind of like a 10,000-foot overview of kind of what the produce safety rule is, how it relates to FSMA, and most of fruit and vegetable farmers have heard about GAP, and kind of what that means in terms of how it relates to your farm. So let me jump in here. So, and move this. Okay, so in terms of food safety, we have a couple different options here. So some are voluntary, but some are required as far as mandatory. So what we have is a voluntary option that you have with GAP certification, or GAP audit is what they call it. So GAP audit is strictly buyer driven, meaning wherever you want to sell, if they require GAP, that would be what they are looking for in terms of like a marketing or a certification. Then you have your produce safety, and I'll get into that in a minute. But ideally, GAP and FSMA are very, very similar. You'll see later that they have very like the same categories. And when you're talking about GAP is not required by the USDA, but the produce safety rule is. So it's all about preventing food safety issues and establishing kind of food safety protocols with harvesting, handling, washing, packing, water, the whole nine. All right. So GAP is voluntary or buyer driven. Then you have your produce safety rule, which is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act that was done, written into law back in 2011. And that was the first time in about 70 years that the US federal laws updated food safety rules and kind of established a scientific regulations on how to have best practices on your farm. Okay, so this is established by the FDA and the USDA, and we'll get into what it all entails. So I'm just going to give you a little overview. Again, these are not all of the rules or the regulations in the produce safety rule, but just to give you an idea, the majority of it is very much, it's common sense. So, but again, so the Food Safety Modernization Act is this overarching theme. And in that act, there are 7 foundational rules. Now, depending where you are in, where your farm or your business lands in the food safety category is which rules you would have to follow. So for fruits and vegetable farmers, we follow the produce safety rule. And there's specific regulations and laws regarding that specific one. Now, if you're making animal food, if you're doing processed foods, that would be preventative controls for human food. If you're doing any third-party certification, that falls under another Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. So, but today we're only going to be talking about the produce safety rule and how that plays. Okay, so again, FSMA is the first ever mandatory federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. So depending on how big of a farm you are, based on income, there are opportunities for exemptions to the rule, meaning you don't have to follow the regulation, but there's always going to be some sort of record keeping. So there's a couple if or statements on if you are exempt from the rule or not. So that's something that I can certainly help you with, or you can check out the rule itself on any of the USDA websites or any of the land-grant university websites as well. But generally, you are exempt from the produce safety rule if you have commodities that are rarely consumed raw. And I do have a little list. I didn't put it in there, but so the rarely consumed raw means you would be exempt from following the rule if you grow solely like asparagus, beans, beets, corn, potatoes, eggplants, pumpkin, squash, sweet potatoes, things like that. So those particular products would not have to follow the produce safety rule. Those are rarely consumed raw. Everything else is considered a covered produce. So tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, you name it, anything that's not on that list that I just mentioned. And again, the exemption is based on average annual produce sales and average annual food sales and sales to qualified end users. So, there's specifics on how far away these qualified end users are and who these qualified end users are. But there's a little chart as well that can help you. But regardless of how big or small you are, it's really a good idea to at least understand and apply these food safety rules to your own farm to reduce food safety risks on the farm and to the public. So again, the rule started back in 2011, and then they added dates to comply to the produce safety rule. And what they did was they started with the biggest of businesses first, and they had 2 years to comply. So by 2018, they had to comply for small businesses, 2019, and for very small businesses with gross income of over 25,000 to 250,000 had until 2020 to comply with the law. And there was a caveat for, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but water. So there's a whole specific subpart of the produce safety rule where there was certain water requirements. And in fact, they just finished and finalized the water rules last week. So we're still updating our information on what that is, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. So if you are a very small business of over 25,000 to 250,000 and you don't qualify for an exemption, it's a good idea to come into compliance with the produce safety rule. And that involves taking one of the produce safety courses, either through the Produce Safety Alliance or any of the other ones that qualify. And I have a list that I can share as well. So the whole idea with food safety is, I'm sure you've all seen in the news, food safety outbreaks. There's been melons and romaine lettuce, spinach, different things. But I know this chart's a little bit older, but the numbers haven't changed too much. But you're seeing a lot of food outbreaks in a lot of the leafy greens, tomatoes, and a lot of the things that we grow on the East Coast here as well. So, it's just a good idea to take food safety seriously and to do your best to manage that risk and safety towards your customers. So here's a little chart that I threw in here, and it kind of goes, this is if you're exempt or not. This is the most basic of charts that I could find. So basically you start here on your left, and is your average annual produce sales over 25,000? Yes or no? So if you're under 25,000, you're not covered by the produce safety rule. Okay, now if it's over, is your annual average food sales over 500,000? Yes or no? If it's yes, you're fully covered. If it's not, do you sell more than half of your food to qualified end users? Yes or no? Okay, so it's just like it's a good little chart to understand if you are covered by this rule or not. So even after you go through that chart there, growers may be exempt from the federal regulation, but not from the market. So we're seeing more that, like farmers markets, distributors, grocery stores are starting to have more and more food safety concerns and do have a requirement of either FSMA or GAP audit or certification in order to sell them food or sell food through them. So it's a good idea to check, even though you may not be specifically covered by the rule under the, what the USDA and FDA say, the where you're trying to sell to or through might require it. Okay, so with the produce safety rule, there's different subparts. And when you take your produce safety training, they give you a manual and it's all broken up into each little tab here and has all the laws and what you have to follow. And I'll get into a couple of them in a little bit, but just keep in mind here, um, the subparts, because they are very, very similar to GAP. So that's kind of on purpose, that they didn't want to make things too different between what the buyer-driven GAP audit is and what the federal regulations are. So if you know about FSMA, you'll know the majority about GAP. So it just goes through, and it's all about produce safety. So different ways to the training for personnel, your health and hygiene, washing your hands, agriculture water. Again, that's the big one. That's subpart E is what they call it. Biological soil amendments of animal origin, BSAAO, and that's something we'll talk about with like composting and untreated and treated soil amendments, different techniques for growing, harvesting, packaging, and holding produce, equipment, sanitation. If you're growing sprouts specifically, there's a whole subpart just on sprouts because they're higher risk and in terms of food safety with pathogens. So, and records. There's a lot of records in produce safety, but again, they're not too bad. So just highlighting a couple of kind of the rules that they have for produce safety. There's a worker training requirement. So basically, it's a yearly training requirement that has to be documented as far as, yes, I taught my workers food safety and how to wash their hands and how to do the job. So this is one of them. Depending on how large of a farm you are, if you're just yourself, or you have 30 employees, 40 employees, whatever, each of these has to be done each year. So just making sure everybody understands what they need to be doing and how to do it safely. Another part is that at least one supervisor, owner, or someone you designate on the farm must have successfully completed the food safety training, like the produce safety training that's offered through Cornell or other places, as long as that standardized curriculum is recognized by the FDA. So I'll be holding at least 2 in the next year, one in our county here in Sullivan or Delaware County, New York, and one across the border right in Pennsylvania. So, you'd be able to satisfy your training requirements and do the produce safety training that way, and you'd get the most comprehensive understanding of the rule. So another part is, this is all under worker health and safety, making sure workers know how to properly wash their hands and have hygiene, knowing that if they are sick that day or have a cut on their hand, to not handle produce without proper, gloves or things like that. So there's certain standards that we want to keep, folks who are sick and produce kind of separate. Of course, hygiene practices, once you're in like a packing house, these are all old hat, people see these all the time. Maintain personal cleanliness, make sure you don't have any, earrings or jewelry that can, fall into the vegetables. If you're out harvesting produce, make sure you're not eating out in the field, um, you know, different things like that. So, these are all common sense and very, very common in packing houses and harvesting operations as well. Another part is making sure that the folks who are harvesting understand and are able to minimize contamination risks. So if you're out in a field, and I'll just use this bottom picture here. It's a strawberry with what looks like rabbit or deer feces. So knowing that if there's a potential contamination risk due to splashback from the rain or anything like that, to not harvest a certain area. And you can see here, looks like lettuce, that there is a lot of destruction here, probably by wildlife. So to have a nice barrier around this area, to not harvest, to make sure that there are no cross contamination in that sense. And then, of course, there is one thing that you'll learn about, which is called dropped covered produce. And this just means to not harvest any produce that has fallen or dropped that is part of the covered produce. So not any of the ones that are rarely consumed raw, but the ones that are covered under the rule. So, for example, if you're out in a apple orchard, you're not harvesting any of the apples that fell to the ground. Okay, that would be drop covered produce. So you're only harvesting the ones that are in the trees. Okay, so moving on. Again, we're just touching a couple different sections here, just to give you an idea of a lot of the, more or less common sense. It's making sure that pathogens and E. coli doesn't spread and doesn't stay on food. Okay, so now there's when thinking about soil amendments, you generally have like untreated soil amendments, which is raw manure, aged or stacked manure, manure teas. Anything that has raw manure mixed in it is of the highest risk category, because it hasn't been treated. It hasn't been the pathogens haven't had a chance to be eliminated through like composting methods or anything like that. So these are your highest risk. So you want to make sure, and there's certain standards on when you can apply untreated soil amendments and how long it takes, but you're applying this prior to harvest, so you're not having those pathogens transfer over to your fruits or vegetables. Then we have treated soil amendments. So this is like compost. So treated soil amendments have like what they call a 0 day, which means they can be directly applied right up to the harvestable day of when you're harvesting your crop, unlike untreated soil amendments, which cannot be directly applied to the harvestable portion of the crop. So with composting, treatment requires a scientifically validated and documented process like composting. So what does that mean? So for example, with composting, we have the two scientifically validated options are aerated static, which means that if you've ever seen different composting facilities, they can add air into the compost, and that would be your basically aerated static. And that is at a minimum of 131 degrees for 3 days, followed by curing. Or you have an aerobic or turned compost, which is what the majority of folks do around here, which is a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 days, minimum of 5 turnings plus curing. So after that, then your compost is scientifically validated and is safe to spread onto your crops or onto your um, land there. So, okay. So there's always, there's certain regulations for composting and making sure that the pathogens are all getting killed by, the curing process and the heating up of the compost. Another section here we have is all about animal intrusion. The best option would be to exclude, livestock, dogs, cats, anything that you can from your crop area. But we all know how expensive fencing is. But you're doing your best to try and either exclude or you can see here in this picture on the right that there are flags in this crop, and that would be identified as like animal poop. So they know not to harvest a certain area around. So you'd be harvesting over here. I don't know if you could see my uh, cursor there, but basically a worker had gone in, identified where there was animal feces in the field, planted a flag, and when folks come in to harvest, they know to kind of do like a certain little buffer in that sense. So do your best at trying to keep out, wild animals and also, personal pets as well. Okay, so now we're moving into water. So again, we're just doing like a little overview of a couple different items from each section. But thinking about water, again, water just was finalized after all these years about last week. So, but water itself, it's broken up into production water and post-harvest water. So you have water that you're using prior to harvesting and water that you're using during harvest or after harvest. And they have two different regulations. So it's all about where your water source is coming from, whether that is public water, groundwater, or surface water. And those go from lowest risk of contamination to highest risk. So public water, lowest risk of contamination because it's already tested, right? Then you have your groundwater, comes from your own property. Now, that is kind of like a middle risk that needs to be tested to see if there's any E. coli in it. Then you have your highest risk of surface water, like ponds, streams, rivers. And that is highest risk because, anything could be there. You could have, you can have ducks come and poop on the water, and it just gets into the water that you're going to be spraying on your crops, and there's E. coli in that water. You can have a dead animal upstream that you don't know about, just different things. So these are the things that we're thinking about with production water. So again, production water source and quality, the application method, whether it's drip, overhead spray, the less contact that the water has with the harvestable portion of the crop, the lower the risk of that crop becoming in contact with water that could have contaminants in it. And the timing of application. So the longer the time between the application of water and the harvest time of the crop, the lower the risks of contamination. And I don't know if you guys remember back in school, it would be like the log die-off rate. And so like the longer things are able to, the application interval, the more chance you have things to die off. So you have, like your pre-harvest production water, then you have your post-harvest water. Now this one is where most attention has gone towards making sure that it's not contaminated, because this is the last step before it goes to the public, right? So if you're harvesting and you are washing your produce, make sure that the water that you're washing or using near harvest time, doesn't have any E. coli in it. In fact, there's the regulation of no detectable E. coli present in the water for post-harvest water. Okay. People can add, sanitizers to water to help, but it's not intended to wash the product. It's intended to prevent cross-contamination. Okay. And make sure if you're using any sanitizer in the water that it's labeled for contact with fruits and vegetables. Okay. So if you're using water for harvest and post-harvest activities, again, there needs to be no detectable generic E. coli. Okay, and that's all the water that is contacting your covered produce during or after harvest. Any water that is coming in direct contact with your food surfaces, so your tables, your knives, your bins, whatever you're using. If you're making ice with that water, and the water that you're using for hand washing, because think about it. These are common sense, right? What's the point of washing your hands if the water that you're washing your hands with has pathogens in it and E. coli? It's like not washing your hands at all. So we want to make sure that we have food safety in mind. I will be sending this presentation out, so I just wanted to add the words in here, but I'm not going to read them all. But just making sure that all your equipment, tools, bins, trucks, anything that you're using to transport is clean and sanitary or sanitized. There's certain ways to go about doing this, but anything that it is contacting the produce or moving produce from A to B, you just want to make sure that things are clean. Another section is the sanitation practices for the areas that you're working in. Just make sure, you're not having mice or flies or pests or standing water. These are all things that can influence like pathogens getting from point A to point B. You step in a puddle in the middle of your packing house and it splashes onto your already clean bins. It's just, a cycle. So do your best. One thing I did want to mention was the difference between cleaning versus sanitizing. This is an area where I get most confusion. So cleaning, and you might think, oh, I already know this, but I'm going to say it again. Cleaning is removing physical dirt on the surface of, say your table. So once you remove all the dirt, you add a detergent like soap, and you clean the table, and you think, oh, I'm done, right? It looks good. Not yet. After that, then you would sanitize it by using a sanitizer. So the deal is that you can't sanitize a dirty surface. Like the mode of actions just don't work that way. So you have to clean the surface free of all the organic matter, clean it with soap or a detergent, and then add your sanitizer. And that would be the proper method to sanitize. So generally sanitizers have certain contact time that they have to have in order to become effective. So you just read the bottle. Some say spray on and leave, and that is the sanitizer, how it works. And some say spray it on and wipe it off. It all depends. So read the bottle. So FSMA inspections are live and well. They've been happening for years now. The way that it worked was they kind of started with the largest of farms on down to the smallest of farms. But or if there was certain outbreaks or issues with certain farms, they'd highlight those as well. So with your FSMA inspections, it's all about, either, taking the produce safety course that we have. It's an 8-hour training, or, another organization has, but as long as it follows the standardized curriculum, then that's fine. But again, we're going to have 2 in the next year here. Record keeping, making sure you have all your records of, the worker training, different things like that, and making sure that you're compliant with all the federal regulations for produce safety if you are covered by it. Okay, so that was FSMA. That's just your general overarching. I gave you a little bit of each subpart to just know the majority of it is common sense. You're probably doing most of this stuff on your farm. It's just the first time that it's kind of written down and set into law. Again, we don't, nobody wants to get anybody sick, right? So I think the water testing is big. I think that really will identify a lot of ways to improve in a lot of places, depending on where your water source is. So, just keep that in mind. And I'm here to help as well. Okay, so moving into GAP. So we talked about FSMA and now GAP. GAP is your buyer-driven third-party audit that if your buyer wants you to get GAP and you want to sell to your buyer, then you'd probably get GAP, right? And it stands for Good Agriculture Practices. Again, it's voluntary and it's pretty similar in terms of the FSMA, the federal regulations and the GAP audit process would be, kind of hand in hand. If anything, GAP might require a little bit more water testing than the FSMA, but, it all depends on which GAP audit your buyer requires. So they have different ones. They have, regular GAP, they have harmonized GAP, they have GAP GIP, which is good agriculture practices, good handling practices. So just depending on what your buyer wants. But again, it's an independent audit of food safety on a farm, okay? And GAP's all about prevention of contamination rather than fixing the problem after. So again, it's super similar to FSMA. It's just making sure that you're following all the federal laws, traceability, record keeping, and documentation. So these are the parts of the GAP GIP program, and basically your auditor would come through and go through each of these sections. It's not a surprise on what they're going to be covering or asking you, because it's all, I'll show you. There's a chart on, pass or not pass, and it identifies each section here. So you have your farm review, where you're harvesting, where you're field packing, storage, transportation. They have specific ones for mushroom, tomatoes. And with GAP, I will say that the way that it works when you get an audit, it's not like it's not your whole farm. It is a specific product or produce. So you'd get GAP for your tomatoes, you'd get GAP for your lettuce, you'd get GAP for your peppers. If you want more than one product audited, then you do multiple audits for the product. But if you pass one, it's pretty reasonable to think that you can easily pass the other ones as well. So again, these are all the different areas that GAP covers and the different sections, which are very similar to the subparts of FSMA. So they're all the same rules and regulations here. So preparing for a GAP audit. Now, a GAP is not free to receive an audit, but the best advice I can give you is to prepare ahead of time. The more prepared you are with your, food safety plan and going through each of the GAP audit sections, the quicker the inspector will be there by, right? So if you're having, if you don't prepare, the longer it takes, the more it costs. Okay. And I forget, I don't recall exactly how much it is per hour for the inspector, but it's at least, I believe it's at least 100 to 125, could be a little more per hour right now. But there are several grants available through the USDA that help with the GAP audit cost. So you can apply for those at any time. So again, preparing for this GAP audit is writing your food safety plan, which I'll be doing courses on, and it's nice and detailed, and it identifies all how you're going to take the food safety regulations and apply it to your farm. And with GAP, they add things like SOPs on how to, clean certain areas or, different things like that. Sorry. So making sure that you do not overcommit on what your food safety plan states, because what you state in your plans shows what you're going to be doing. So when your auditor comes, if you make this, glorious food safety plan, and you're saying, I'm sanitizing every single, knife after each produce that I cut, and that's not what you're doing, that's not very good. So make sure you're just doing what's realistic on your property. You don't have to go crazy, okay? And of course, there's plenty of food safety plans and templates available online. I am helping with all of this right now through a grant that I'll show you guys at the end. So I can do one-on-one technical assistance to help you. So again, preparing for this audit, make sure you have a food safety officer or whoever is in charge of the record keeping and knowing all the laws. And you would prepare the supporting documentation with farm maps, any water test results that you have, the training certificates that you have through produce safety, and just go through it. Just do a mock audit for your own property if you're getting GAP to make sure that you are able to go ahead and pass. So here's one of the pages I pulled up, but this is basically what the auditor comes through with. And it's basically a yes or no, answer to the questions. Do you have a documented traceability program? Yes or no? Yes, you get 15 points. No, you get no points. Have you done a mock recall? Is drinking water available to all workers? Different things like that. And so you can go through and you can do your whole mock audit to know if you're going to pass or not. So it makes it very easy. They're not trying to like trick anybody. They want food safety. They want things to be healthy. So why are folks getting audited these days? It's because their buyer wants it. So if you are looking to do wholesale or distributors, anywhere that requires it, it's just a stamp of approval that you can have, and then you can go ahead and sell through them. So even though the USDA, the federal regulations, doesn't have a GAP certification, many buyers have their own requirements for vendors. So just see, if you're deciding on buyers to sell to, just what their requirements are. Okay. So a lot of with FSMA and GAP is record keeping, but it's not so it's not so cumbersome of records. There's we have plenty of templates available like on our website or the Cornell website, and they're all like, just that you've cleaned and sanitized after the day is done, that, you did your worker training, that, different things like that. It's mostly just a date and a signature. So it's not too bad. And for those who have ever, done records with like different production systems, like, chickens, for example, we always want to know how many eggs we have that we've sold. It's no different than any of those kind of records. So it's just keeping all of that information in one area. So making safety, food safety number one priority for your consumer is a great idea, to let them know that they can have confidence that, they're less likely to get sick from buying your produce because you do take food safety at a high goal. And, the more certifications or audits or things like that you do, you can always have considered a premium product, and it demands a premium price, right? Okay, so finishing up here, I left time for questions. This is our Catskills Farm Food Safety Training program that we have in our county. So if you are in Wayne County, Pennsylvania, Delaware County, New York, or, or Sullivan County, of course, or you want to take any of these online webinars wherever you are in the country, that is totally fine. We are working on identifying fruit and vegetable farmers that would like to be trained for produce safety or are required to, because they're covered under the rule, or their buyers require it as well. And I am, in addition to doing these classes, we're doing, record keeping compliance. I'm helping individual farms with their farm food safety plan. We're helping with gap audits, and we have funding for a consultant as well, beyond myself, to get you ready for a gap audit and help you get certified for the New York State Grown and Certified program. Okay, so these are all of what's coming up in the next year. So I'll be this is the kickoff here for Alphabet Soup, and then we're going to be moving on into plenty of other training in food safety and also technical assistance. So I'll come to your farm, we'll walk through, I'll help you out. Okay, so thank you.